Enjoy your lunch and dessert. So we're back here for the lunch segment of our program today, and we've got a special segment today because every year since 2007, the Arms Control Association staff has nominated several individuals and institutions that best exemplify leadership and action in pursuing effective arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament solutions. And each nominee on the list, which is about 10 or so people each year, in their own way, has provided leadership to help reduce weapons-related security threats. And once we nominate, we open up the online polls to let you and others around the world decide who is the most deserving of the honor in any given year. And we do this to highlight the fact that there are, in this sometimes very discouraging business, success stories each year, and there are heroes, and there are bold acts of leadership. There are new ideas to solve tough problems, acts of dogged determination, and people who take personal and political risks in the hope of reducing the threats posed by the world's most dangerous weapons. And we're very pleased this year to have with us as our keynote speaker our 2014 Arms Control Person of the Year, otherwise known as Alexander Kmentt of Austria. And he earned the highest number of votes in our end-of-year online poll last December, surpassing 9 other worthy candidates. And those other worthy candidates included the runners-up Ahmet Zumcu, the Director General of the OPCW, and Sigrid Kaag, head of the OPCW UN Joint Mission, for their work in removing 1,300 metric tons of chemical weapons from Syria. And Pope Francis, none other than Pope Francis, who's on the cover of this month's Arms Control Today, was the second runner-up in online voting, though I'm not sure if the Catholic world was aware that we had this online poll. Nonetheless, campaigning for the title is allowed and encouraged, and Alex won this year's honor. And though we've had several winners in the past, this is the first time we are bestowing the award in person. Alex Kmentt is now Austria's Director for Arms Control, Nonproliferation, and Disarmament, and he started his career at the Austrian Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs in 1994, and I'm sure even before then was active. And he's been a leader on a range of arms control issues over that time, from the Non-Proliferation Treaty to cluster munitions, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and other topics. And the 2014 Arms Control Person of the Year Award is in recognition for his work to organize and host the 3rd International Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons from December 8th to 9th in Vienna, which included delegations representing some 158 states, I think it was, the United Nations, and many, many more from civil society around the world. And this conference built upon the work of the 2 previous Humanitarian Impacts Conferences, and the Vienna meeting in particular expanded the agenda to talk more about the physical impacts of nuclear weapons use in modern circumstances, the health effects of nuclear weapons production and testing, the application of international law to the consequences of nuclear weapons issue, and the shortfalls in the international capacity to address a humanitarian emergency triggered by the use of nuclear weapons. And as many of you, if not all of you, know by now, for the first time in this series of conferences, the list of participant countries included 2 of the nuclear weapon states recognized by the NPT, the United Kingdom and the United States, and 2 other nuclear-armed countries, India and Pakistan, took part in the Vienna meeting and the previous 2 meetings. And the award is also in recognition for something we heard about earlier this morning, Austria's pledge at the close of the Vienna conference, quotes, to cooperate with all relevant stakeholders in efforts to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons in light of their unacceptable humanitarian consequences and associated risks. And that Austrian pledge has been endorsed by 80 states, perhaps more at this, 84 at this stage. And truly, the Vienna conference and all 3 of these conferences, in the renewed focus on the global health consequences of nuclear weapons production, testing, and use, has changed the international conversation, I think, for the better, and provided renewed urgency to the long-running effort. As we heard before, it will continue to be a long-running effort to move toward a world free of nuclear weapons. So, Ambassador Kmentt, thank you very much for your hard work, dedication, and vision. And we're very pleased to bestow you with this award. Modest in size and appearance though it may be, it represents a great deal of work, and we thank you very much for all you've done.
Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, why don't you put it there? And now Alex will address the topic of the Humanitarian Initiative and the NPT.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the very, very kind words. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here today. First, I have to apologize to Daryl because I know that this is also supposed to be a fundraising event for the great work that the Arms Control Association is doing. Of course, it's a significantly bigger challenge to do this with me as keynote speaker than it would have been with Pope Francis. But I'm of course extremely happy to be here and to get this great recognition. I'm aware, of course, that I got elected because there was a civil society campaign to push me over the finishing line, because friends and family alone would not have made that happen. But I know, of course, that the real arms control person of the year is the Humanitarian Initiative. And the intensive focus of the past few years on the consequences and risks of nuclear weapons. So I'm extremely happy. This helped me a great deal. It went down extremely well with the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Even the Foreign Minister made a press release because of that, so it didn't hurt and harm me. I also realized that this is, of course, a real expert audience here. An audience very much tuned in the nuclear weapons debate from a nuclear weapon state perspective. Experts on Russia relations, China relations, very much focused on the Iran and DPRK issue. So an expert audience that may, and if I'm wrong, please, I apologize, an expert audience that may not have been so tuned in the humanitarian debate and may not be so tuned in the way nuclear weapons are seen by the non-nuclear weapon states, the vast majority of UN member states. And so I thought I'd use this opportunity to try to explain this perspective, which now enjoys a clear support of 3/4 of the international community and UN member states. So I'd like to give first my take on the development of the initiative of the past few years, and secondly, make a few points where I think this initiative has had and will have a significant impact on the nuclear weapons debate. Of course, the humanitarian focus or the humanitarian issue itself is not a new one. That's very clear. It underpins all efforts that we do in multilateral work to establish a global disarmament and nonproliferation regime. This notion is encapsulated in all the preambular paragraphs of essentially all the treaties. But of course, the focus has been very much on the security dimension, on the nuclear deterrence dimension, especially in the Cold War. So the recent focus, I always say the humanitarian initiative is inspired by the Prague speech from President Obama, because he re-energized the disarmament community. Now the specific focus on the humanitarian dimension, I think, can be traced back to the International Committee of the Red Cross, where former President Kellenberger gave a very important speech to the Geneva diplomatic community just a few weeks prior to the last NPT Review Conference. He recalled the ICRC experience as the first humanitarian responder present in Hiroshima, and he highlighted the completely inadequate capacities to address the humanitarian emergencies that would result from any news of nuclear weapons. And of course, as the guardian of international humanitarian law, the ICRC president also stated the ICRC finds it difficult to envisage how any use of nuclear weapons could be compatible with the rules of international humanitarian law. So this speech by the president of the Guardian of International Humanitarian Law was intended to be and proved to be very important input for the 2010 Review Conference. The final document included the following reference, I quote, "The conference expresses its deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and reaffirms the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law." And it was actually the first time since the adoption of the treaty that such a reference was explicitly included in an NPT Review Conference document. But Action 1 of the 2000 Action Plan also included the following reference. It committed all states parties to pursue policies that are fully compatible with the treaty and the objective of a world and the objective of achieving a world without nuclear weapons. So the expression of the humanitarian concern plus Action 1 became a sort of de facto mandate for many states to pursue the humanitarian initiative as a means to implement their own treaty obligation of Article 6. So there are, of course, those actions that only nuclear weapon states can do, but there are others, including deepening understanding on the humanitarian dimension, that non-nuclear weapon states can do. And this focus then became operationalized very substantively in the course of the subsequent years. First, through joint cross-regional declarations initiated 2012 by a group of 16 countries, including Austria, and at subsequent meetings of the NPT and the General Assembly, the group of 16 countries endorsing these joint statements grew to 160, and the latest statement endorsed by 160 countries was delivered by the Austrian Foreign Ministry just a few weeks ago at the beginning of the NPT Review Conference. It is actually, to our knowledge, the biggest cross-regional joint declaration ever on a substantive issue in the UN context. So more than 3/4 of UN member states have felt compelled to highlight the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and the need to prevent such consequences through urgent progress on nuclear disarmament. And it also includes, of course, a lot of states whose voices are hardly ever heard on this issue. And I think that also must be considered a significant shift in the discourse on nuclear weapons and nuclear disarmament. And the second track, of course, are the international conferences specifically dedicated to this issue. First one in Norway in 2013 and 2 last year in Mexico and in Vienna. And these conferences added very substantive evidence, research, and findings to the humanitarian debate. And there is not enough time to go into detail, but very clearly it was seen as extremely interesting from the non-nuclear weapon states' perspective to look at the actual impact of nuclear weapons. And there are, for instance, as a spin-off from the climate change debate, really disconcerting findings on the long-term consequences, on the climate, on food security, which findings that go beyond the studies of and findings of nuclear winter from the 1980s. So the scope, the scale, and the interrelationship of these consequences are worse and more complex than previously understood on the environment, climate, health, socioeconomic development, social order, and so on. And the systemic dimension of these consequences is hardly understood. On the health side, for instance, new finding on a distinct gender perspective that radioactive contamination is disproportionately higher for girls and women. Also new findings. Then the element of risk was examined in more detail, looking at doctrines and war plans, at risks of accidental, mistaken, unauthorized use, the vulnerability of command and control systems, human error, cyber attacks. Eric Schlosser's book, for instance, was extremely instrumental in this context. So even when individual states take measures to reduce risk, as an aggregate, globally, the risks are increasing over time. And added to this, of course, are today the risks from non-state actors and terrorists gaining access to nuclear weapons or material. And then, of course, of key relevance to this debate were the very clear warnings from virtually every humanitarian responder, from the UN system, from the ICRC, and also from a national perspective, that no capacity exists to deal with the humanitarian emergencies or the long-term consequences of nuclear weapons explosions, specifically, of course, in populated area. There aren't even any plans because it's seen as a futile exercise. So the need and the urgency for prevention was strongly into focus. At the conference in Vienna, we also looked at the legal aspects. If you look at the consequences, what does existing international law has to say? So international health law, environmental law. It is impossible to conceive the use of nuclear weapons without breaching existing international law. And the ICRC, based on the new evidence, stated that in light of the new evidence, further doubt is cast on whether nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with international law. And then of course, we also had that in Vienna. We looked at the moral and ethical dimension. We were extremely fortunate to have a message from Pope Francis there and a position paper from the Holy See. And the Holy See further developed its position from the 1980s. And I just wanted to quote one paragraph from this, from the position paper. I quote, "Since what is intended is mass destruction, extensive and lasting collateral damage, inhumane suffering, and the risk of escalation, the system of nuclear deterrence can no longer be deemed a policy that stands firmly on moral ground." I think this is a highly significant shift, and it's echoed increasingly by other faith-based organizations, and I think it will have a lasting impact on the nuclear weapons debate. So we aimed in Vienna to pull all this information together and take it to the NPT with as much support as we can. And I'm happy to talk about how this impacts the NPT discussion right now in New York. But I wanted to use the second half of my talk to make these few points that I think how the humanitarian impact may have, or in my view, has had a lasting impact on the nuclear weapons debate. The first one is that a large part of the appeal of this initiative, the statements and the conferences, lies in the openness of the process. All states, even those who are normally not very visible in the nuclear weapons debate, they can participate and they can actually make pertinent point, because from that perspective, they also have a clear stake. And this debate in that context is not as dysfunctional as the existing structures that we have. We talked about the Conference on Disarmament. So it's a positive and engaging debate in those meetings. The non-nuclear weapon states can set a progressive agenda or make these voices heard without being procedurally stifled, which is unfortunately the case in the existing structures. Then the role of civil society and academic experts is not only, they are not only invited, they are welcomed as an extremely important contribution to a broader and more, to a more broader discussion on these issues, which of course brings in constituencies beyond the arms control community, and that's extremely important and makes the discussion we have in the other fora look sometimes more anachronistic and undemocratic. So the need for a more open discussion on those issues and broader discussion, I think, is one thing that has really come into focus. Secondly, the support from the support for this initiative, of course, has to be seen in parallel with the developments that have taken place in the arms control world. And as I said before, it was in a way stimulated by the Prague speech in 2009. But as high as the expectations may have been in 2009 and 2010, the developments that followed, unfortunately, didn't live up to them. And it became increasingly clear to the non-nuclear weapon state that the determination from nuclear weapon states, although of course there are big differences, but that this determination to really implement the action plan with a sort of sense of urgency that non-nuclear weapon states thought came out of 2010, that wasn't there. And I think the nuclear weapon states haven't really grasped how much the modernization plans and budget allocations, which clearly indicate a willingness to retain and rely on nuclear weapons well into the second half of this century, how this undermines trust in the disarmament commitments given under the NPT. So the humanitarian initiative in a way gains strength also as a function of the increasing credibility and trust deficit experienced by the non-nuclear weapon states, and sort of as an outlet to express the sense of urgency. So that's a second point, which I think will just simply get stronger, and we see that very much in the NPT context as well. And then thirdly, I believe that the humanitarian, that the substantive discussion from a humanitarian perspective actually challenges the nuclear deterrence orthodoxy and the acceptance of that orthodoxy by a large part of the international community. The case for nuclear deterrence rests, of course, on the credible threat of inflicting unacceptable destruction to a possible adversary. But of course, we all bank on the assumption that the threat will succeed, that these capacities will never have to be deployed. But we have to be clear that the credibility of the threat requires the readiness to use nuclear weapons. And since the mid and long-term consequences based on these discussions and findings of even a limited nuclear war would be considerably more serious than previously understood and most likely global in the consequences, in such a context, the notion of a credible first strike or counterstrike becomes largely irrelevant, or winning a nuclear war is almost impossible and seems like an absurd idea. This doesn't square with the underlying foundation of nuclear deterrence, namely that it leads to rational behavior of all actors, because if the consequences for friend and foe alike and all humanity, that's the logic of it, are devastating and essentially suicidal, the threat itself becomes incredible. And what's left is, of course, the considerable danger of escalation in crisis situations between nuclear weapon states, and the trust that in the end it will not come to the worst. But the reasoning that governments are always rational enough to handle nuclear deterrence, and that nuclear deterrence works because it makes governments always act rationally, is essentially a circular argument. And then, in order to avoid these global consequences, nuclear deterrence is required never to fail. But the new discussion on risk, or the new understanding on risk, raise serious doubts to what extent this requirement can be fulfilled. Because there is an inherent contradiction between maintaining nuclear weapons in a manner that demonstrates readiness to always use them, which of course is required for the credibility of nuclear deterrence, and the need to ensure that they will never be used by accident, human or technical error. The measures that would be necessary to reduce the risks associated with nuclear weapons are the ones that restrict readiness to use nuclear weapons, thereby undermining the case for nuclear deterrence. So it seems from the, I believe, broadly shared non-nuclear weapon states perspective that nuclear weapon states are stuck in a vicious circle of maintaining an uncontrollable and ultimately uncontrollable risk of inflicting global consequences, or to reduce these risks, which essentially would remove the arguments in favor of nuclear deterrence itself. And then, of course, added to this is the clear understanding that there's no capacity to deal with these consequences in a remotely adequate way. So we heard before, nuclear weapon states are so concerned that the humanitarian initiative has the aim to make nuclear weapons illegal under international law. But in reality, I think it's not the legality of nuclear weapons, but the legitimacy of nuclear weapons and the security approach based on nuclear deterrence that has come into clear focus as a result of the humanitarian initiative, and that is being challenged. Nuclear weapons have catastrophic consequences. Their possession carries considerable risks. Their use would be illegal, except maybe for a small range of mostly hypothetical scenarios. And the combination of these factors, together with the underlying readiness to commit mass destruction, make them immoral. And these views, this line of argument, I think, is gaining significant ground in the international community among the non-nuclear weapon states against the background of frustration and trust deficit and credibility deficit, and that's what we're seeing in the NPT at the moment. The fourth point of the humanitarian initiative, therefore, is that it sort of exposes a very clear rift, and we talked about this before, in the international community on the approach towards nuclear weapons and what should be done to address these challenges. And states that continue to make the case for the step-by-step approach, even though from my perspective it's not a very credible approach at the moment, but the logic is that it has to be done, nuclear disarmament has to be done in a way that allows for the maintenance of nuclear deterrence. But I think non-nuclear weapon states increasingly see this as an argumentative stretch to insist on nuclear weapons for one's own security, but that these weapons should be kept out of the hand of everybody else, and at the same time being in favor of nuclear disarmament. So I think this argument has become increasingly more difficult to make, and the humanitarian initiative has thus more clearly exposed a double standard there. And I think it also puts into question whether reliance on nuclear weapons and support for nuclear disarmament are not essentially mutually exclusive concepts, or at least in the view what nuclear disarmament should mean in the eyes of probably a majority of NPT member states, as against the view what nuclear disarmament means from those who promote the step-by-step approach. And it will be problematic, of course, for the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime if this rift cannot be overcome. But I think nuclear weapon states need to realize that they sort of can't have it both ways. To maintain support for the NPT and the global regime, much more credibility needs to be added to nuclear disarmament efforts. It's difficult to imagine how support for non-proliferation can be maintained if NPT nuclear weapon states, who of course are also the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, continue to advocate a security concept that is increasingly seen as illegitimate by the rest of the world, and that has actually implication that goes beyond the nuclear weapons debate. Let's have a look, for instance, at the P5+1 talks. Of course, they are broadly supported because nobody wants to see a nuclear weapons program. But the fact and the irony is not lost on anybody that it's states who argue for the importance for nuclear weapons for their own security while insisting on the unacceptability of these weapons for other states. So nuclear weapon states are actually proliferating the concept and value of nuclear weapons. And I think that is a very damaging recognition by non-nuclear weapon states that is actually the case. The credibility of non-proliferation efforts would be greatly enhanced if it would be accompanied with a much more determined move away from nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And that leads me to my very short fifth and final potentially lasting impact, or what I hope the humanitarian initiative should be, because it strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons as such. Building case for the illegitimacy of nuclear weapons based on the consequences and associated risks, that works as a strong set of arguments for disarmament and non-proliferation. So the humanitarian focus should be, or is maybe, the best hope to shore up broad international support for the NPT and for the creation of a strong and for the maintenance of a strong disarmament and non-proliferation regime. It should be seen as a wake-up call, and it should really be embraced, and it should unite the international community into much more urgent action on these issues. And unfortunately, from the perspective that I have now after 2.5 weeks in the NPT, that the pushback is much more fundamental. There's not even a recognition that there really is an issue. And I think that makes me very pessimistic or skeptical to what extent we will be able to bridge these differences. But with that, I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. I think it's very important to outline the origins and, as you see it, the implications of this effort, and to clarify misperceptions that are out there about it. We have a few minutes for you to ask Alex your questions about, Alex Kmentt, your questions about this issue, the NPT Review Conference. Just once again, please raise your hands. We have microphones, and we will bring the mic. Let's start here in the front with Paul Walker at the Walker table.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It was very, very helpful and very interesting. I want to ask you a little bit about the future of the Humanitarian Initiative. Where do you think it's going to go after 3, very interesting conferences, as well as the NPT this year?
Why don't you go ahead?
I have no idea. I think what I tried to outline is a broad support for the substantive notion behind it, and I think some of the conclusions, there is a large convergence among the non-nuclear weapon states. But in terms of how to operationalize this into a concrete way, I think that's still a very broad church. And in the previous panel, we heard that in the NPT, it goes in a lot of different directions. There is, of course, the sort of ban discussion is getting traction. NAM still talks about everything has to take place in the Conference on Disarmament. So I think it's still very unclear. The 3/4 support for this is on the substantive dimension, and I think the nuclear weapon states have, in my view, made a mistake to look at this initiative primarily from the question on process, where does it lead to, rather than engaging really on the substantive and sort of legitimate questions that are being asked. Because, even proponents of a ban treaty would say, of course it's not the best option. Of course it's better to go forward broadly. And I think that was very clearly also our intention and the way we tried to structure the conference in Vienna, to package it sort of as input for the NPT. But what are we getting at the NPT in response to it? At the moment, it's not very clear what this is going to be. So what would happen after the NPT? There could be a fragmentation of different initiatives, but there is no clear plan. There was talk at some stage that South Africa may host a follow-up meeting, but they haven't made any concrete steps and haven't said anything specific. But I believe that the narrative itself, the initiative itself, will of course go beyond the NPT. It will be raised, I think, now from the proponents in every fora and every framework that we have.
All right, thank you. There was a couple other questions. Yes, over here, and further in the back. Why don't we take 2 at a time? Please identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Martin Fleck, Physicians for Social Responsibility, and we are excited that you got the award, very well deserved, and we spent considerable effort last year to urge the United States to send a delegation to Vienna, and we're glad that they did. But my question for you is, as organizers here in the United States, You've got 84 nations that have signed on to the Austrian pledge. We could wait for a long time before the United States signs on, but what would you advise us to do, those of us who want to promote the Humanitarian Impact Initiative here in the United States? What would be most helpful?
All right, and then Stephen Young.
Stephen Young with the Institute of Scientists. Alexander, first, congratulations, well-deserved award to you. The question actually for you is just to have you give us your sense of how things are going in New York now and what you expect, what might happen in the next couple of weeks.
We were extremely happy that 2 nuclear weapon states decided to come, and I hope that they didn't regret the decision. I think it was also very important that because of the increasing debate here in Washington on whether or not to participate, also the expert community, think tank community got more engaged in these issues. And I think this is probably the most important spin-over, that there should be I would say the discussion should be primarily on the substantive issues. Is there really, and we're getting a pushback from nuclear weapon states in the NPT who challenge the fact that there is even anything new, that there is even an issue. And I think from at least the perspective of the non-nuclear weapon states who of course know less about these issues than nuclear weapon states, but from their perspective there is a lot of new and pertinent information. I think that would be very helpful if there would be more of a discussion on these issues from a humanitarian angle, rather than which I think is the normal type of discussion that takes place here, very much from a security policy and nuclear deterrence-based focus. So if you address nuclear weapons issues from the impact of nuclear weapons and the risk issue, I think that may have that may be a good contribution to the debate. What it will lead to here in Washington, of course, I don't know and don't want to comment. But I think it's important to move away from an exclusive focus on process, but really get into the substance. That is also, at the moment, I'm very pessimistic because we felt that we have spent 5 years building a case for a renewed urgency based on humanitarian arguments, better understanding on risk. And what we're hearing in New York from nuclear weapon states, also of course with differences, but by and large, is that there is no new evidence, there is no issue. The French ambassador, for instance, said risk is a non-issue. So he doesn't, I mean, there is no discussion on it. And that, of course, is perceived, I think, as very frontal. So we had the action plan, we have the arguments and the sense of urgency and the expectation of urgency, so there needs to be more. And if we don't get that, then I think the NPT will have taken a blow, and the credibility of the NPT as a disarmament framework, which already is in dire straits, will be further weakened.
Let me just ask you a further question on the NPT, if I could. I mean, based upon what you've heard in the formal presentations from the 5 original nuclear weapon states and in the closed conference rooms, have any of them brought forward what you or some of your colleagues involved in this initiative would say are new ideas or new initiatives to move forward on action step 5 of the 2010 action plan? I mean,
No. I think I think the push from nuclear weapon states is primarily a rollover of 2010, which of course doesn't match up to the expectation that, of course, the countries that have pushed the humanitarian initiative. I mean, it's 160 countries of what is the number of NPT member states? It's 190 or so. So there is a clear feeling that consensus should be built around that view, that there is a sense of urgency. Just if I may, coming back to the previous panel and the discussion on an open-ended working group establishment, it was an idea that Austria, Norway, and Mexico pushed in 2012, and it was established and met in Geneva in 2013. But nuclear weapon states opposed the establishment of that group. I mean, it met anyway, and I think it did some useful work, but there was an explanation of vote on the General Assembly by the P3 explaining why they vote against it, why they think it's a complete waste of time, and stating that they will disregard any outcome. So, I mean, it was a very difficult review cycle for the states that felt that the action plan and the positive agreement 2010 was actually a call for urgent action, because it didn't transpire in the multilateral battlegrounds, if I may say.
All right. Why don't we go to Susan Burke in the middle and then over here on the right?
Congratulations, Alexander.
Thanks.
And thanks for your remarks. You made a comment that the nuclear weapon states made a mistake by looking at the initiative as a process. And I want to say, I think looking at it from outside the government, I'm not representing the government, maybe after Mexico, that would have been legitimate, because clearly the conclusion documents suggested that this was leading to a convention, which I think all of P5 indicated they don't support. And the Vienna conference seemed to put it back more on a track of addressing, as you say, the practical issues. What's the likelihood or the appetite for using this to really have a substantive discussion with technical people about consequence management? I was kind of encouraged by the statements that have been made in New York that it's including the risk of non-state actors and terrorists. And in a previous life, when I did Homeland Security for the State Department, that was one of the issues that was being looked at, was consequence management with the Department of Homeland Security and partner states. And these were public exercises looking at how do you manage a plague event or a radiological event or something, as being seen as the kind of thing that nations needed to be concerned about. If it went in that direction, and it sort of to create a confidence or have a discussion on issues that maybe all could agree, yeah, these are legitimate concerns. I mean, is there any appetite for doing that kind of thing? It sounds like what you're saying, but I'm not sure.
I think the nuclear weapons states really made a mistake. The first conference was organized in Oslo. It's a NATO country. They were very cautious in how to structure the meeting, but received a coordinated P5 position on non-attendance, saying that it's a distraction from the NPT. And I have to say, I think this was the fundamental tactical error from nuclear weapon states, because of course Norway of all countries certainly would have liked its NATO nuclear weapon states allies to be there. And I think that in a way energized a sort of more political dimension, which we then saw in Mexico, and the wish of states to make political statements there, which of course didn't happen in Oslo, which was very much focused on the technical and fact-based side. I think to answer your main question, I think it would be very important to engage on these substantive elements. There was yesterday, which I think was very welcome, was a briefing organized by the US mission on the issue of de-alerting. Of course, it's was a bit, from the substantive side, it was a bit disappointing that de-alerting, which sort of seems to pretty much everybody as the absolute logical first step to reduce risk that should be taken and could be taken, and there's vast support for a UN General Assembly resolution on this issue, and the US basically gave a number of reasons why more concrete steps on de-alerting are not possible. But at least that kind of engagement on substance, I think, is extremely important. So there should also be an engagement on response capabilities. And of course, that's going to be a difficult discussion for nuclear weapon states to have, because if the consequences are global, how do you explain to, for instance, countries in Africa who have done everything right, they are all members of a nuclear weapon-free zone, how can it be explained to them that the consequences would impact them as well? But I think engaging on that kind of discussion has been mostly lacking so far. So I think it would be very good to demonstrate that these concerns are taken seriously and that these are absolutely legitimate questions and they shouldn't be just pushed aside into the sort of this just has the agenda to push a legal ban. I think that's a mistake.
All right. All right, we have time for a couple of quick questions. Right over here, Shervin, there she is, and Edward Levine, and then we'll close. Please.
Thank you. I'm Veronica Cartier, and I always for the openness. In this sense, that I would like to express that I'm glad. I'm so happy that I voted for you. You are the right
I hope
person.
all of you voted for someone.
Yes,
Yes.
maybe all of us, but I think you are in the right person for the right position. You stated a non-deterrent orthodoxy, which is, I think, that is factual.
I'm sorry, I didn't
And
catch
also
Deterrence orthodoxy.
Okay. Yes.
deterrent orthodoxy, and also the factual of threat maintaining of readiness. I think currently we are in the sense of looking for the readiness. And I would like to address a question in the sense of urgency. What direction and advice you can give for the nuclear proliferation states in their framework to reduce errors? Because I think that is we need to focus on that. Thank you.
All right, and then let's take the final question. Edward Levine, please.
Edward Levine, retired from the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The nuclear weapon states are clearly afflicted with contradictions, as you have pointed out, in that if they are sensitive to the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, they still are not going to let that interfere with their reliance upon deterrence. But it seems to me that the non-nuclear weapon states too often fall into a similar set of contradictions in which they say if there is not enough urgency shown on disarmament, we won't support non-proliferation, as though proliferation would be of any use to them from the humanitarian standpoint. So I wonder, from your position, working with the non-nuclear weapon states, what can be done to focus your efforts more clearly on what is doable by everybody rather than on the exchange of brickbats?
Easy questions.
Easy
both,
questions,
yes.
yeah. On the issue of reduction of errors, I think that is a question that really nuclear weapon states have to address. I think non-nuclear weapon states can make the point that the information, the findings that we hear is disconcerting, but how the command and control structures are set up, of course, greater degree of transparency would be welcome, but that is an issue that really nuclear weapon states can or should answer. On the question from Ed, well, I agree that if you're looking for contradictory positions, the disarmament and non-proliferation world is the right place to look. Yeah, I mean, the humanitarian initiative has the support from some countries who probably have an agenda that's not totally humanitarian driven. I think that's a problem. The way I see it, it should. I mean, the NPT is an uneven treaty, but of course it's clearly of security benefit to everybody. But of course it clearly benefits primarily the nuclear weapon states. So what can be done through the humanitarian initiative is apply pressure. And I think this is the pressure should not be that if you don't disarm, that everybody else will proliferate. That's absolutely clear. But the bargain of the NPT holds only if nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation deals are upheld. And the very clear voice coming that the nuclear disarmament bargain is not upheld, we hope, will compel the nuclear weapon states to do more to uphold their end of the bargain. I'm not sure that this is a satisfactory, specific answer. Yeah? There are a whole range of legitimate questions that are being asked. There is, of course, an implicit building up of momentum that if the NPT is not delivering, that other developments could happen. And I think in order to stop that from happening, and maybe stopping some crazy things from happening, nuclear weapon states should really take this much more seriously to keep it all in the NPT, which is certainly what most countries that support the humanitarian initiative want. So they want to see progress in the NPT. But what's on offer?
And that's the question we'll have to leave you with for now. We're out of time for this session. I want to thank you once again, Ambassador Kmentt, for all your groundbreaking work, your dedication, your persistence. Like many of you here who've worked at treaty negotiations, I was just talking with Larry Weiler about this. It takes time from one's personal life, and I know that you've dedicated a lot, and I'm glad you could be here with us today, especially in the midst of the NPT Review Conference. Thank you.